Robert Gottlieb is a professor of urban and environmental policy and the director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute in Los Angeles. He has authored over 12 books, including Food Justice, which is the topic he will present on today. Other books include Food, Health, and the Environment, Reinventing Los Angeles, Nature and Community in the Global City, and The Next Los Angeles, The Struggle for a Livable City. He's also a co-founder of the National Farm to School Network, a program that connects small local farmers to school lunch programs nationally. Throughout the Health at Google speaker series, we've heard a lot from doctors on how to improve our overall personal health through diet, exercise, and other lifestyle choices. Professor Gottlieb comes from a different perspective. Rather than looking just at personal health, he strives to answer broader questions, such as what are the social, economic, and political forces that have brought us to this point, and how can communities come together to fix problems like hunger, malnutrition, as well as how justice plays a role throughout. Please join me in welcoming Robert Gottlieb to our campus.
I understand that in talks like this, we get always lots of feedback, so that'll be helpful, I think, in terms of what I want to share with you. Let me start. Let me do a couple of things. I'll tell you a little bit about the program we have at the Urban Environmental Policy Institute, which includes a number of programs around food issues. Everybody's looking over there. There we are. And then I'll kind of situate that in terms of this book that Anupama Joshi, my co-author, and I, Anupama is actually the director of the National Farm to School Network, and both what we mean by food justice and then how we illustrate that both in relation to the issues and problems around food injustices, and then some of the stories that we've identified of groups and movements and individuals who are trying to bring about system change. So the urban environment, I'm a professor at Occidental College. Alyssa was a student of mine and very engaged in food issues, as are a number of other folks at Occidental. The Institute's an interesting mix. It's kind of a hybrid between kind of a research and educational entity and one that involves engaging in action and policy change. And as a hybrid, we not only try and identify some of the issues and problems, but how you start bringing about change. So an illustration of that would have been when we started the Farm to School program, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We wanted to get it inside the Los Angeles Unified School District. So we presented the research we had done to demonstrate where it had first begun in a smaller school district in Southern California, and how it could be applied to the second largest school district in the country. And we found a lot of resistance within the school bureaucracy, within food services. And so we decided that what really needed to happen is a policy change. And in order to get a policy change, we felt we needed to really reach out to students and parents to be part of the process of bringing about that change. And what happened, in fact, was some of the key issues we identified were not only what was going into the cafeteria, but where the kids were going in terms of getting food that is known in school food language as competitive foods, namely the vending machines where you had the sodas and the junk food. And that became the alternative to food that was not considered very appetizing in the cafeteria. So we focused on that, and we hired some parents to be organizers to reach out to both the kids and to the parents, and started a campaign. And the starting point really was the vending machines and getting the sodas out and identifying, for example, through our research, the average amount of sodas consumed and the sugar quantities involved in the amount of soda that a teenager would drink in the course of a week. And it was a mason jar full of sugar. And that became the symbol of the campaign. That's what, this was back in 2001, 2002. And out of that campaign and out of the work in identifying the issues, the LA Unified School Board passed the first really major change that took place around sodas and vending machines by banning sodas in the vending machines and having a student constituency that was engaged in the issue that became really important part of the process. So that's a kind of thing that we do in our institute. We identify programs, we do research, we do organizing, and we bring about policy change. And we operate on a multiple set of issues. We basically have a social justice mission. We deal with issues of immigration and housing and transportation. But our largest set of programs are in the area of food. And amongst those, we do this farm-to-school program, the idea of getting local, regional food grown by local regional farmers into school cafeterias and other institutions like Google. We have a program called Farm to Preschool, and we focus on preschool because aside from the importance of thinking of preschool to K-12, it's also some of the fastest increases in obesity and weight gain are happening in the 0 to 5 population. So it becomes an important way of thinking about how do you change the way kids think about food and what kind of program do you develop in order to bring about that change in perspective and attitude and connection to food. We have programs that deal with women, infant, and children program. We call it Farm to WIC, where we are going to places where WIC coupons are used, like the stores that only sell WIC products, and trying to get local food into those stores, fresh produce into those stores, that the people who have the WIC coupons, who qualify, low-income women with infants, can have access not only to fresh food, but local food that is going to be that much more appealing. We have a program that deals with the connection with food and transportation. The whole area around food access is really a significant one because you can urge people to change their feeding patterns in terms of what they will eat. You can urge them to go to a farmer's market or to go to a market that sells fresh produce. But if it's not in the community, if you don't have access to that, then you've got significant issues in terms of changing the food culture. And that's particularly important in terms of thinking of the people who are most vulnerable in terms of how the food system operates. People in low-income communities don't have supermarkets, don't have farmers markets. So we have a whole program we've developed around food and transportation. We also have a program we call the Regional Food Hub or Food Hubs, and I'll talk about that in a little bit also because that would be an interesting project to describe in terms of thinking about the needs that we have to make that operational. But the concept of the food hub in short is that if you have now this idea of making the connection between people who grow food locally and people and the institutions that can access that food, how do you create a system where you can have multiple farmers working together and the institutions identifying the needs that they would have to get that food, and like in LA, we also work with food trucks, for example, to try and get healthy and fresh produce into the food trucks as well, and that maybe they could use a kitchen facility in a food hub. So it's a complex concept of making those linkages and making a system work to support what we would call a regional food economy or a regional food system. So that's what we do. Lots of projects. We try and innovate, develop new programs. We evaluate them. We think about the policy context. We do organizing. And our students get engaged in a whole range of these programs as well. So that's what we do. And as part of that, we've really become part of a kind of an emerging food movement around the country. And the food movement has many ways of addressing food issues. And within that, we have begun to make the argument that food justice within the context of an emerging food movement is really critical. And by food justice, we think of it in a number of ways. On the one hand, we do think of it in what we call the food system or system ways. So we think about, if you think of it in supply chain terms, from growing, producing, processing, manufacturing, distributing, retail, where it's sold, and how it's consumed as a system, from seed to table. What is the nature of that system? What's happening within that? Particularly from a perspective that says, are there environmental problems in that system? There are. Are there issues of disparities? There are. Are there issues of undermining local and regional farmers, whether in this country or abroad? There are. Are there issues around worker injustices, whether it's in the confined animal feeding operations where much of our meat production is now based, and the people who work there subject to kind of occupational hazards, subject to a whole wide range of exploitation that goes on in terms of those operations, whether it's in terms of thinking about people who work in retail, or in restaurants. I was just last week in a press conference in LA for an organization called the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which is an organization that got formed out of the bombing, the World Trade Center events, the 9/11 events, where the top on the world restaurant was destroyed. And when it reopened sometime later, the restaurant workers were fired to bring in a non-union, lower-wage workforce. And so the workers who had been displaced set up their own cooperative restaurant, but then started advocating for around the conditions of restaurant workers. And so the press conference that I was at was related to a release of a report of the conditions of restaurant workers, something that food movement might or might not be addressing, but which is really critical when you think of it in system terms. And these were issues around wages, in terms of occupational issues, in terms of no sick time, where you'd have people who would be working, didn't have the ability to take off time when they were sick, and they were serving your food. So that becomes a kind of a central food justice issue of how not only restaurants can maybe be more sustainable and source locally, but also how are they treating the people who work in those places. So food justice is a perspective on system issues. It also looks particularly at the disparities within that system, where you have people who are most vulnerable. Even as you talk about the system as a whole creates problems for everyone. And I think there's no better example of that when we think about the issue of this issue of weight gain and obesity, where you have all population groups have seen this change taking place in the last 3-4 decades, and particularly pronounced in the last 20 years, across the board, age groups, ethnic and racial groups, income level, but those obesity levels are most pronounced amongst people who live in low-income communities, people of color, who, going back to that food access issue, are most vulnerable in terms of what kind of food they do access and what are the circumstances, the system circumstances that they experience in terms of their connection to food. So you have obesity as a consequence of the way our food system is organized for everybody. It's a system issue, but they're also those who are most vulnerable. And then the third approach we take in terms of food justice is that you ultimately can't separate the idea of food from other kinds of social and economic issues that come into play and constituencies that are impacted by those issues. So another way of thinking about food justice is you're also connecting it to things like transportation or land use. What's happening when we lose farms at the urban edge and you instead have a real change in the nature of the kind of the metropolitan region and all the related problems that go along with that. Food issues are powerful environmental questions. What are the inputs in terms of how food is grown? How is that changing and as we become a kind of a more industrialized food system, and both in terms of the production of food as well as even in the retail sector where, to use a term that an English theorist called it, the kind of industrial food retail that has really developed, where, for example, Walmart in 1987 had 0% of the market share of food retail, and today it has over a third, and it is by far the largest food retailer in the world. And its practices, how it retails food, and how it's organized is very much part of this kind of industrial food retail model. So we see that happening in terms of thinking about how these systems operate across the board throughout the supply chain. So the food justice book was really an attempt to do two things. On the one hand, to document in the first half of the book how, if you do kind of a walk through the food system, what happens at each stage of that food system that addresses these questions of food justice and food injustices. And the second half is telling kind of a narrative of where and how there are efforts to change the way the food system operates from a food justice perspective. So you have a wide range of initiatives that are taking place around the country and around the world that are seeking to define a kind of an alternative to the direction in which the food system has evolved, particularly in the last 30, 40 years with these massive changes that are taking place in food growing, in terms of the manufacturing and processing of food, the retail side, where we and how we consume our food as well. So some of the stories included, for those of you who have the book, there's a wonderful photo on the cover of the book of a group in Holyoke, Massachusetts, called Nuestras Raíces. And they started about 15 years ago, where Holyoke, Massachusetts is a very poor community. It's actually the poorest in the state of Massachusetts. It's heavily Puerto Rican. And so a number of young people decided that they wanted to do something to deal with the problem not only of lack of healthy food, but that they wanted to connect back to the traditions of food growing that they and their families experienced growing up. And so they started an herb garden, growing the kinds of herbs that were part of their cuisine. And they expanded to become not only growing food, but creating what could be considered like a little mini food hub in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and doing a range of other kind of economic development programs for the community, using food as the centerpiece. So that's telling the story of how that group got started and how it's really mushroomed into kind of a major player in rethinking food in Western Massachusetts. Another group that we profile, which we have folks have come here from the Salinas Valley, is a group called ALBA, which has done a remarkable job, and you actually have the advantage of having some of the ALBA Organics produce here at Google. ALBA started out trying to identify, well, it has a long, complex history, but in a nutshell, it tried to identify the ways in which people, mostly immigrant farm workers in the Salinas Valley and other parts of Central California, could be able to make a transition to themselves participating in becoming food growers. Really a critical transition if you think about both from the justice perspective of how farm workers are treated in California and in this country, but also in terms of skill and knowledge and capacity to grow food, that you don't have that opportunity to do that. So that's the evolution of the organization, was how you have some land that could be made available to farm workers who can become farmers. And it's part of a broader theme that we talk about, where you are seeing for the first time a shift where there are more farmers in the last census of agriculture than there had been in the previous census. This was the 2007 census, and I think you will see in the 2012 census of agriculture even more striking change. It's not that we've seen a wholesale shift in agriculture, but you're starting to see pockets, particularly Asian, Latino farmers, women, and young people, the sort of four constituencies of people who are becoming connected to the land, reconnected to the land. Of course, it also takes place in urban settings as well as outside of urban areas, and in the form of the community garden movement, the urban agriculture movement, ways in which people start thinking about food growing as a culture, a vocation, and in fact, a way to have a sustainable livelihood. So that's another story we tell about, and we talk about the group in Florida, that tomato pickers in Immokalee County in Florida, who suffered incredible abuses in terms of the patterns of recruitment of people coming across the border, to being sent into the fields and really being subject to conditions of near slavery, locked up, subject to a wide range of abuses, and incredibly low wages that were provided for the tomato crop that was being picked, and some of the other crops in that part of Florida. And what happened back in the mid-90s is desire by some of these folks who were most subject to these conditions and started to expose this kind of near slavery conditions, to think about ways in which they could, given the weight against them of changing the situation in the field, how could they begin to shift, make a dent in that kind of imbalance of power and lack of capacity of farm people working in the tomato fields to bring about a change. So they created an organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Some of you might be familiar with them. And they decided that the growers, the large growers, were not going to yield at all to the idea of not only a kind of a wage increase, but to recognize and give some dignity to the people who were working in the fields in terms of their representation. So they thought, well, let's go upstream. Who purchases the tomatoes? And they started by targeting Taco Bell. They had a 4-year campaign to say, we want a penny a pound more, and we want some recognition in terms of the rights of the people who are working in the fields. And we want you to agree to that and then pressure the growers to bring about that change. And they mobilized students around the country and people of faith who got involved in thinking about food justice and social justice as their issue that they could engage with and identify. Went from Taco Bell, they finally succeeded after 4 years. They went to they went after McDonald's. They went after some of the retail chains, and just as our book was released in October, we would be going around the country, and we were happy to say that they finally got the growers to agree. It's a great victory. Limited, penny a pound, a little bit of recognition, enormous obstacles, but a really inspiring story of people over time mobilizing, getting constituencies to hook up with them, and bringing about that one change that becomes then emblematic of how that change can magnify and develop further in terms of related kinds of issues in the fields or in other parts of the food system. So let me end with, I'll tell you a personal story in terms of some of this work and connect it back to Farm to School, which is one of the signature programs that have developed in Farm to Institution. We were trying, this was about 15 years ago, to think of ways in which we could support farmers markets in low-income communities. There was in particular one market that had been the very first farmers market in Southern California that was set up in the late 1970s when they made their revival. Actually, farmers markets were designed in the late 70s and early 80s as kind of food justice institutions, if you will. They were designed to bring affordable, healthy, fresh, local food into communities that had lack of access. The first farmers markets were sponsored by a group called the Interfaith Hunger Coalition in LA, in places like Philadelphia and Chicago when they were started. There was a group in Philadelphia called the Food Trust. These were really kind of low-income strategies for fresh food access. They changed. Farmers markets obviously have changed over time. For a lot of good reasons, in the sense that it became very popular, and so it became very attractive in communities and middle-income communities and places where there might not have been quite the same food access problem, but there was real interest in getting healthy, fresh, local food, and there were community institutions, so great gathering places where you don't have that kind of those kinds of places. But in the process, it's not that the low-income markets were abandoned, but they tended to be more limited. Fewer farmers were coming to those markets. There were the burdens of how to find the appropriate places for those markets. So we were trying to figure out how could we support the farmers market in an area, this was the Gardena area, and reach out to low-income folks in that southwest region of LA. And we found it was really difficult. We tried a CSA model, but one where people would pay at a subsidized rate and maybe only have to pay once a week rather than once every 6 months. It wasn't working. So we thought, well, what we really need is the places where you can have kind of the institutional support for this. And that was the origins of thinking about Farm to School. And at that point, my daughter was in a school in Santa Monica. Santa Monica sounds like one of those wealthy enclaves. It actually has low-income enclaves within the wealthy enclave. And the school where my daughter went had 50% free and reduced student body. In other words, 50% of the kids qualified for a free and reduced lunch, which meant that they were hovering near the poverty line. So my daughter would come back and tell me that, the school lunch sucks. They tried a little bit of a salad, but the lettuce was brown, and she actually liked getting fruit and even vegetables, and she wanted something different, and so she was going to not eat in the school cafeteria. So that was sort of like an epiphany for myself. Why not go to the school? So we went to the food service director, a fellow by the name of Rodney Taylor, who was then the food service director, came out of the food industry. His picture is in the book. An industry guy, food service industry guy. Bottom line considerations, you don't do anything different. You gotta have the food that the kids will connect to. So that means you gotta have the chicken nuggets, you have to have the pizza, you have to also buy the commodity foods because you're under constraints on budget. So we came to him and said, we have a thriving farmers market system in Santa Monica. Why not get the farms that are coming to the farmers market to set aside food that they bring to the farmers market that can go into the school cafeteria? And Rodney said, he tells the story and goes around the country. He said, here was another rich white parent with too much time on his hand coming and laying this issue on me. And what I'll do is I'll test it out and I'll show that the kids will not eat the fruits and vegetables. So he set up a salad bar as an alternative to the hot meal. It's the way some of your school cafeterias can have these choices between the offer and serve system, it's called. So he decided he would have pizza the first day as the alternative to the salad bar that was set up with the farmers market produce. And the kids came. We hired an organizer to help reach out to the parents, a young Latina, fresh out of UCLA. And she got feedback from the parents about how the kids would respond. Make sure you've got a slice of lemon or a lime that you can squeeze on the lettuce, and you can do X, Y, and Z in terms of how you show where the food is. And sort of the big breakthrough with the kids was they did actually have a school garden. And so we did some tastings, and the kids said, well, that looks like the food that was coming from the farmer's market, from the local farmers, looks like our food from the garden. And we love that food from the garden. We just never connected to having food in the cafeteria. So by the time the day came around and Rodney set out the choices, 75% of the kids chose the salad bar. And it blew Rodney away. He said, as he talks about it now, he says, it changed my life. It gave me a sense of purpose that I didn't have, that I needed to become a champion for the kids, and I could see that becoming a champion of the farmers was the way I could become a champion of the kids. And that was the origins of Farm to School. At that point, there were only 3 programs around the country. This is 1997, the one in Santa Monica, and 2 small ones in North Carolina and Florida that were designed to support farmers there. Today, it's in all 50 states. It's been embraced by Michelle Obama. It was part of the recent child nutrition legislation that just passed. And it came out of a kind of history of mobilization and of practice of trying to show why this kind of approach creates change at each level. And it symbolizes for us the food justice story, because Farm to School is a system change. It's for everybody in terms of a school food system. But it's particularly, when you think of it in the public school system, you have kids who are a substantial portion in places like LA. LAUSD, for example, is 70% of the kids qualify for free and reduced lunch. I bet you if we go to East Palo Alto, we'd see that kind of those kinds of numbers, or in Salinas, or in San Francisco, in some of the school districts. So you're also talking about kids who otherwise might not have access to that type of food. So it's also becomes a food justice story in terms of those who might be most vulnerable. And it's finally something that allows you to think about learning about food differently is also a way of thinking about a deeper set of issues that one comes and encounters, whether it's how you grow food and what does that mean in terms of environment, and what are the economics of food and how is it operating. So it becomes also a teaching lesson and a way to connect to a number of different, very powerful issues that we need to confront in our communities. So I'll leave it at that. Open it up if you have questions or thoughts or things you want to share. Our folks from Alba are here if you want to ask them about anything. I had an op-ed yesterday, I guess, in the San Jose Mercury News, talking about some of the Alba farmers, but also the connection of immigrants and food. There's an interesting article I read coming up in the paper in the New York Times this morning in the food section, in the dining section, about how immigrant cuisine is changing suburban areas in places like Indianapolis. A fascinating article. And I think it's part of thinking about new ways of we're just starting to address food in this country and in our society. So, questions, thoughts? You can clap, it's all right.
I'll be the first. Fantastic talk, thank you very much. I was just wondering if you could draw a connection between food and social justice to justice for animals, what we put on our plates, or what some of us put on our plates, because I think you read umpteen different books out there, and the conditions for workers working in factory farms and working in slaughterhouses and so forth is probably among the most abominable for all workers. So if you could just maybe comment on that a bit.
Yeah, two connected points. First, in terms of there are important constituencies out there that are talking about what's happening to animals in the factory farm system, particularly in these confined animal feeding operation structures. There are incredible environmental issues as well in terms of the waste that are generated and the kind of pollution that's associated with it. And there are these animal abuse issues that are really important. But to separate one set of issues out from, as you rightly pointed out, the issue of worker justice and work conditions for the people who work in those places, it really limits us. And that's really part of the message of food justice, is to not make that separation, but see the connections between those sets of issues. There's a wonderful phrase that Eric Schlosser used talking about the tomato workers. He spoke at a slow food conference, and he was saying, look, do we really want to eat an heirloom tomato if it was picked under conditions of slavery? And I think so that's really important, that you not separate the two. The other thing about what's happened in terms of the processing plants, we've really seen a big shift that began in the 60s and 70s, influenced in part by the kind of supply chain issues that led to the feedback to some of these processing operations, how the meat was being produced in effect, and for whom, whether it was the chickens that were being turned into the chicken nuggets. And the workforce that had been in those processing plants up through the 1960s tended to be a relatively stable union workforce that had relatively decent wages as production workers had at that time. And when you started seeing these changes in the supply chain and the way the processing plants operated, you basically saw a wholesale shift away from that workforce. A lot of folks were, the plants were moved to different places, like in Colorado, and an immigrant workforce was brought in that was non-union, highly exploited, and subject to kind of some of these horrific conditions that we've read about in terms of what goes on, and whether it's the poultry plants or the meat production, the beef production plants. So yes, it's very much connected. And part of our argument to the broader food movement is that it's really important to make those links, to not separate out one issue from the other.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So how do we get grocery stores in poor neighborhoods? I mean, my understanding is they're just like convenience stores, and it's just like there's no access to produce or anything reasonable for the people, even if they want to get it. They just can't get it.
Well, it's a really important question, and there are actually a couple of different answers to that. On the one hand, there are efforts to say, why have the supermarkets, for one, the larger full-service markets, why are they not in the urban core areas, in the inner city areas? They used to be. There was really a major change that began again as we see other changes going through the food system happening in retail. Beginning, say, in the mid-1960s or even a little bit earlier, where you had kind of the flight from urban areas to suburban locations, often close to freeways, very parking and car-centric places. So that disadvantage when you sort of build your market around the idea of access by car rather than other strategies for access, you disadvantage your urban core areas where land is actually more expensive, more limited, so you can't have that big parking footprint. Number of reasons that were all part of the change in food retail. Markets were leaving, were abandoning the urban core. Well, there's now emerged, a lot of work in this area saying, the markets have to come back in. It's their social responsibility. There's also an economic opportunity. As the suburban markets became saturated, there have been sufficient number of studies out there that really make a compelling argument that food market, even with these constraints around land costs, and the income level of the shoppers, you still can have significant economic return. And those markets that have been set up that have made that jump have turned out to be very successful. But there's still a lot of resistance. So there's been a lot of organizing trying to do that. Hasn't gotten as far as it ought to. The other part of that is to think about either the alternative kinds of places to access fresh food, like farmers markets, and making them more viable, increasing their capacity. So a core food justice demand, for example, for a farmer's market, is that they be able to accept SNAP benefits, the food stamp benefits, and have the system, the electronic benefit transfer system that would allow them to access the farmer's market. And then there's yet a third initiative that's going on called the Healthy Corner Store Initiative, which is looking at stores, the small stores that have historically been kind of too expensive, limited, if any, produce, making their money off of candy and cigarettes and liquor, if they were liquor stores that were defining themselves as food stores. And how do you change that situation? What do you do to really make these more responsible kinds of community stores? And so there's an effort in Pennsylvania called the Fresh Food Financing Initiative that has really created an incentive-based program even as simple as creating refrigeration in these smaller stores. It's also been bolstered by the fact that we have more ethnic markets now that have developed at the kind of the small store level. So there are some changes that are taking place in that level, but it's a core problem that it doesn't go away and needs advocacy at all these different levels.
I think you might have just answered a lot of my questions, but I live in the inner city in Oakland, and I taught there for 5 years, and that's, it's definitely, there were no not many very quality grocery stores in the area where I taught, but I've noticed that recently, actually Whole Foods, which is kind of an extreme as far as pricey foods go, has opened up in not the worst area, but also not the nicest, and every time I go there, it appears to be doing great business. So are getting stores like Whole Foods or, maybe lower price versions, smaller versions of that in the city, does the actual city government tend to play a role? Like, do they, can cities kind of deal with or approach companies or individuals interested in this, or does it tend to be more kind of organic individuals forming their own groups and approaching the stores themselves?
Did everybody hear that? Okay. The answer is actually both. That there's a role for policy, including local policy, to ensure that not only that a store comes in, but that the store, for example, hires locally, has fresh produce, and is the other kinds of things that are important, like has the culturally appropriate foods in that store. All those kinds of things can lend themselves to different kinds of policies that advantage stores who are doing it and disadvantage stores who are refusing to do certain kinds of things. And there are different policy instruments that are available. We did a study when Tesco, which is the third largest global retailer they're American, they're a British company, and they entered about 5 years ago into the U.S. under the name Fresh and Easy Neighborhood Market. And their target is to sort of undercut Trader Joe's. And so we did a study of how Tesco operates globally. And in that, and you can access it to our website, we listed a range of policy strategies that you can have to really, and specifically designed in that case with Tesco and Fresh and Easy, what can you do when somebody wants to kind of increase their footprint in different communities, or they're not going into communities, they're going into one set of communities versus another. So there are a lot of policy opportunities, but ultimately you can't make change unless you have people who are advocating and mobilizing and seeing themselves as part of a movement to bring about that change. And there are examples, illustrations of when that's happened, when people have mobilized, where they've brought about that kind of change. So, another question. And then I have a question for all of you.
What would be the top 2 things that Google can do to be the most forward-thinking and progressive for a corporation of this size? I mean, we are almost 30% supportive of small farmers and local farmers, like our relationship with Alba. We do have a really high food values, high in sustainability, but if we really wanted to push it, what should we be doing?
Great. That was actually what I was going to ask all of you. And I'll give you my take on it, but I'd actually like to hear your take as well. Certainly the role as a major institution is important. And there are a whole range of ways to do that. One, of course, is what food is available and where it's being purchased from and how you scale that up. I understand you have a CSA for Google employees. All those kinds of strategies are important. There are other things that you might have or not have that people are exploring. We've been talking with Kaiser, for example, about the idea of I don't know if Google is self-insured or what relationships they have around health insurance, but there are strategies to advantage, for example, your insurance premium goes down if you're a member of a CSA. Sort of thinking about how you incentivize the change that could take place. So as an institution, there are a whole range of opportunities and the partners that Google has. So it extends not just in terms of this place here and what food gets purchased, but how does, where and how does Google operate itself in terms of other places, other facilities, other partnerships that it has, where it can talk about its connection to bring about changes in how people relate to food and where it comes from. I think the other piece of that connection that Google could make is, right now we're in a situation where some of the stories that we talk about, things like Farm to School, for example, are at a stage where they have moved from, how can I best put it, from the pilot stage to something deeper. But in doing that, there are both barriers and challenges of how you make that happen, keeping the eye on the prize of the type of regional food system that you want to support and the justice component throughout it. So this food hub is a great example of that. There are all kinds of needs now as it gets this farm to institution model expands, of linking farmers who operate, when they operate individually, find that they can't really be an effective supplier. So you need to aggregate, you need to connect. But then the institutions have different needs. And there's also land that's not being farmed that could potentially be farmed, particularly if there were that connection to somebody who needs crop X at point Y in terms of their needs from an institutional perspective. So there are a range of kind of tech issues, if you will, of how to configure a system based on this hub model where you're aggregating, consolidating, you're doing maybe even some processing, connecting, and then you're going out to the institutions. And this is the where Farm to School was 15 years ago, the hub model is today. It's just beginning, it's catching on around the country. There are ones in Northern California, there are ones in Southern California, in San Diego, there's one emerging in LA. And then also, how do you link that statewide so that it operates? So those are the kinds of needs. And there are other illustrations of that as well.
Talking about making food shed into an economic model and aggregating a food shed.
It's an economic model, but it's also, it's defined not simply as an economic model, but it has a kind of social justice mission associated with it. But whether it's in terms of support of the local farm groups and the farm workers, as well as in terms of who gets, who can access the supply if, in fact, there are issues around the price points or there are schools that don't have kitchens. So one of the things that we modeled is a kind of a floating salad bar that could actually be brought to the schools. But there are also policy changes that you want to bring about. So there are technical issues within the building the capacity to create that kind of alternative regional food economy, but also a justice-based regional food economy. So let's set up the meeting.
We don't have enough land for all of our students coming out of our program, and then at the K through 12 level with the kitchen prep areas and whatnot. I was at a meeting with our congressman and the local K through 12 in Watsonville area, and if everybody's on board to do more of this, bring in fresh local produce, but they don't have the area to prep it. So in our case, just our growers need access to more capital and more land. So it really comes down to economics, money, and how we can find a better source like that. So don't know, maybe a grant or something to help stimulate that, just to get everybody on track.
Well, getting back also to thinking about the points you're raising, how would you identify land that could maybe be made available for food production, including in urban areas, for example, as well as in terms of land that's either lying fallow or is unutilized or is foreclosed land, and what's happening to it. So kind of the inventory issue is also significant. So there are lots of possibilities, and it's, the food movement and the food justice movement is both a new movement, but it's very rapidly taking on really both major opportunities and major challenges. We've seen a shift from, just thinking of it in terms of my own trajectory when I got involved in the early 90s, an enormous shift in consciousness that's taken place, in discourse around food, in ways in which the desire to do things differently around food is out there, but the capacity to make that change is uneven, even as we start seeing some of these breakthroughs.
On that note, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to having the capacity be increased, I guess, to have this movement be, take greater hold?
Well, I think we're at a point where there are real potential institutional breakthroughs, and how those institutions have operated is going to be the challenge. So let me give you an example. Walmart's announcement that it wants to purchase local and organic. The argument I would raise about Walmart doing that is, on the one hand, I think it's a great victory that this global food retailer, which had only defined what it would get into its stores, is now saying, well, this is important. It has to reach out. It's also vulnerable to the criticism of the role it's played. So on the one hand, it's a great victory. On the other hand, it's at best cautionary, if not dangerous, because of the way, in fact, Walmart operates is that it doesn't have that approach of thinking of a justice orientation. It does put the squeeze on its suppliers. It dictates the terms of it. And we told a story in the book of from a local Midwestern grower who recounted it to us, of when Walmart really wanted to get into the Chicago area, and so it wanted to kind of scale up its reputation. So it said, well, we're going to go organic and we're going to go local to show to people in Chicago that it really was capable of moving in this direction. So it decided it would highlight local watermelons in the summer. So it contracted with one of the largest of the growers, still kind of a medium-sized grower, and said, well, here's our supply needs, and this is the price you're going to have to agree to, and here's the volume needs and when you have to do it. And as a consequence, that grower became a broker and bought out basically the watermelon crop in a radius around where the Walmart was supplying. What that meant is that there were, A, no watermelons that season in the farmer's market, and B, the growers were getting less of a price through the Walmart system than they would have through a direct marketing system. So that becomes the challenge. As the opportunity to change the food system, the way it operates, we increase that capacity, we're going to start meeting these kinds of challenges. And then thinking about how, in fact, you're going to continue to build without then becoming squeezed by who the dominant players are and how they operate. So it becomes a political challenge, it becomes a social challenge, and it becomes an organizational challenge. And we'll see what happens, but we're at that point. Well, I thank Google for setting this up and having some books available to you. And hope we can continue the dialogue.